with that, welcome everybody. I have a great guest today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation as someone who's never served in the military, but grew up an Army brat. I have a great affinity for talking to military veterans and getting their unique perspective on things. So I just want to give a quick introduction to Colonel Rob Campbell. And then Rob, if you could just give us a little bit on your background and then what you're doing today and a little bit about the particular type of audience that you serve with what you do today.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's good to be with you on the show here. Rob Campbell, Army veteran of 27 years, turned leadership author, speaker, and consultant. I was an infantryman and a paratrooper in the Army, served in the 101st, 82nd Airborne Division, Iraq and Afghanistan. Wrapped up my career in 2016 and didn't know what I wanted to do. Like most transitioning service members, kind of stumbled into book writing, and that's where I realized, okay, I could make a living off of this, or at least start a business on this. And I started speaking and coaching, which I still do today. And I got into entrepreneurship, and I bought a small business here in Johnson City, Tennessee, that sells window fashions. And you wouldn't see that as a match, but for me, it's a vehicle to give back to the community and a chance for me to get a team around me again and practice what I preach. And so on a journey, 6 years deep into my military transition since I served, and still traveling the journey.
So speaking of journeys, that's a perfect transition into one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which was as an Army brat, I've moved 21 times. My dad was in the Army 30 years. I think some of it rubbed off on me because a lot of that was obviously after my dad retired. How many times in your 27-year career did you move?
We moved 16 times, and you're right, it gets into your DNA. It's like every few years goes by and, okay, what's next? Where are we going, right?
Yeah, so for those of you who have moved 4 or 5 times for a job or a career and think that's a lot, no disrespect, but military service members and their families have a little bit different lifestyle, which I talked to my 84-year-old mom, who also said, just to give you a little bit of context, I never served, but my dad was in the Army for 30 years. He was in infantry. He was a Green Beret for a while. My mother served 28 and a half years as a civil servant working for the Army and the Air Force. My brother was 6 years in the Air Force. Almost every uncle that I can think of off the top of my head served in some branch of the military. I was one of the few that never served. My parents drilled into my head, you're going to get a degree and you're going to go a different path from us. And so as a good son, I listened. But I have some memories from days growing up as an Army brat. And I'm curious, some of the things that you might remember. Some of my memories include little things like I still carry these little guys around when I go camping. P-38s. So for any of you civilians, you can get these on Amazon for like $1 and change. It's a little can opener. And some of the phrases and habits that were ingrained in me, little things like early is on time is late. The term strack. Can you talk about the term strack? Because that's something my dad used to talk to me about. Is that still a term that's used in the military these days?
Yeah, they still use it as far as I know. It's an acronym, John, and I forget what it stands for. It was in Colin Powell's book. And there's those letters stand for certain things, but what it represented was a high standard. Everything is lined up, neat, clean, ready at the top of its game. And so you might use strack and, oh yeah, this guy or this gal coming into our unit here is strack, right? They've got it together. They're the very best. So quite simply, that's what it meant. So yeah, we still use that.
Yeah, I don't think my dad ever explained it to me. I was in junior ROTC in high school, and I just remember him saying, when you get your uniform together for uniform day, which is once a week, you need to look strapped. So I remember that. Better to have it, not need it, than need it, not have it. That was another thing that was ingrained in me. I'm that guy who's always got the fanny pack that everybody makes fun of, who also is the one that they go to when they're, hey, do you have? Yeah, I'm that guy. And then I'm obviously older than you are. I didn't grow up with MREs. My dad used to bring home C rations.
Oh yeah.
Way back in the day. So
sure.
And then the last one was voluntold. which I think has seeped its way into the civilian world as well. But we got
Absolutely.
voluntold for a lot of stuff as a kid. So the question that my mom wanted me to ask you, growing up a military wife, was how do you feel the Army has improved on how it works with military families as they adjust to and deal with military life? Because back in the day, it was difficult. It was challenging for the spouses, especially.
Sure. Yeah, when your mom grew up, the philosophy was if the Army wanted you to have a wife, they would have
They
issued
would have
you
issued
one.
you one.
Right. And what a horrible philosophy. It's funny sounding, right? But what's behind that was just horrible. And that's why I have such great respect for your mom and that generation. My mother-in-law is a Vietnam era Army wife, and she served during that time. The Army, at least, and the military writ large, I'm confident in saying, has come leaps and bounds when it comes to families. They don't see service members as individuals. They see them as family units because they know what motivates that person, what drives that person day in and day out is knowing that their family is cared for or will be cared for if they have to go into harm's way. So, old boss of mine once said that family readiness, which is what it's called in the military, and it's a great term. It means the families are ready to endure the rigors of military service, to endure the separation that will happen in service. He said that family readiness is a METAL task. Now, METAL stands for Mission Essential Task List, and we would use that to describe how good we would become at, like marksmanship and maneuver, different things like that were all part of our warfighting craft. Well, he added family readiness as a METAL task. And by saying that, it gave it the emphasis that it needed, meaning it needed the commander's attention. It was part of his or her task list in terms of getting that company, that organization at the top of its game. So tremendous programs, really great inclusion now. It's just so much better than it ever was.
Well, that's good to hear. Definitely good to hear. And I thought it was interesting too, even as a kid, we were stationed sometimes on Army posts, sometimes on, or I guess near Air Force bases. My dad retired outside of Homestead Air Force Base. And I noticed immediately, even just as a kid, it seemed like it was a different standard. And I'm sure there are lots of differences between branches. Do you feel like any of that has changed over the years? Or is it more mission focused that drove that?
No, maybe a little bit. I mean, there certainly is a difference from living on a military base than off, because you're guaranteed that all your neighbors are serving like you. Although, nowadays, the population around a military base has really become very heavily military because of the transient nature and the fact that there's not enough military housing on base. So you find a lot of that. So I like to think a lot of that bleeds into the populations outside of military bases. But it's different wherever you go, John. Like I served in the 101st Airborne Division, and Clarksville, Tennessee is right outside the base of Fort Campbell. One of the best military community known across the Army anywhere you go, because this is, the population is so integrated with that military base. Whereas you go in some other places, probably Washington, D.C. would be a good example, where you find that's not the case, where you don't have to go far off the base and you're really into, you're immersed back into society.
Interesting. So you mentioned a word that kind of leads into a question. You mentioned the transient population around the bases. And I'm kind of curious, when it comes to, so as a leader in the Army, obviously the tours of duty relative to civilian jobs are much shorter, right? What's a typical tour of duty in the Army these days? 9 months?
Anywhere from, no, it's right around the 2-year mark. That's about the average.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I guess that's starting to track more towards civilian jobs now that civilian jobs are not, people are changing jobs a lot more than they used to.
Right.
The question that came to mind is with people transitioning in and out of your command, rapport is one of the areas that I think about a lot when it comes to communication. And it makes me wonder if there was a sort of a sense of urgency in building rapport with those new people that were coming in, because you kind of had to get them up and running pretty quickly. So I'm wondering
Sure.
if there were any things that you could think of that were particularly handy in your sort of toolbox to quickly develop rapport with new people when you became their leader in their new role.
Yeah, well, we had the good fortune in the military that I often say, you know, I moved all over the world, but from unit to unit, base to base, I could be assured of certain things: a family program, a leader development, career path, you know, a performance appraisal, and things like that. So you find those wherever you go. And so you had that. We were all kind of the same cloth when we came together. So we weren't that far off. It wasn't a stretch to kind of build those relationships. There was that immediate trust that you get with service members because we you know, we're all in this thing together. I think you can replicate a lot of that in a private business. It takes a little bit longer, and leaders got to be better at it, because the difference is, you know, you're not life or death is not at stake. Livelihoods are, and the mission is no less important. But it's those things that we did to you know, the sponsorship, or somebody came in, it wasn't just like, okay, here you go, here's your desk. No, okay, you're now part of this team, and let's get you introduced to everybody, get our arms around you, find out what you need, meet your family, and all those things help this move along quicker. Things move at the speed of trust, John, and the quicker you do things like that, make someone feel like they belong and they're welcomed and they're part of the team immediately, get their family embraced, then things move along a lot faster. You can build that rapport and enjoy the benefits we had in the military.
So it makes me wonder about, I was talking to somebody the other day about coaching, and how they made a comment about how, if you look at most of the great coaches, sports coaches, they tend to have, whether it's innate or learned, this ability to identify the way someone needs to be led, motivated, communicated with. And they'll know
Indeed.
when we have like a group huddle, they talk one way, but they know that there might be a guy that needs to be pulled to the side, and this guy needs an extra pat on the back, but that guy needs the extra kick in the ass, just based on how they're wired, right?
Sure.
Did you find a lot of that in the military as well?
I did, because we had the good fortune of studying leadership and practicing leadership in some very, very difficult situations. And when the chips are down and there's danger or there's hardship, just from running PT on any given weekday, or being out in the field and fighting the elements, that's where you see the true nature of people come out, and their character, and all that bubbles to the top. So it kind of fast forwards the getting to know somebody, John versus Sam versus Mary versus Sarah, on what makes them tick. And therefore, leaders could apply their leadership in different ways. I had 7 different, in the brigade I commanded, the 101st, I had 7 really, I call them subordinates or franchise organizations underneath me, separate elements. And every one of those 7 leaders, I had to lead differently. It was because I took the time to invest in them and to get to know them as quickly as I could. So happens in the military, but that's what coaches do, is they're able to see that person on a deeper level and then tailor their leadership towards that person.
Could you talk about, you mentioned the 101st, and
Yep.
could you talk a little bit about what is the primary role of the 101st in the Army at large? Because it's a little bit different mission, right? As I understand it, and it's a I'll say it so you don't have to be humble about it, but being in a unit like that is, my guess is, outside of like official special operations, it's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty elite unit,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about what the 101st is about?
Yeah, the 101st is at the end of the day, a land force element of 3 maneuver brigades and then some aviation brigades. What's unique about the 101st is its ability to move around the battlefield. It's the most mobile Army military organization in the history of warfare. It can lift up a brigade with rotary wing aviation and move it across the battlefield from place to place. So it gives it that uniqueness. It's got a tremendous history, obviously, all the way back to World War II. But at its core, it's an infantry unit with the supporting elements around it, a full division that can close with and destroy the enemy, fight its nation wars. It can do a variety of things, but it's one of the Army's premier divisions. There's this saying, in places like the 82nd, 101st, because they fall under 18th Airborne Corps, which is, known for its readiness and its ability to get places quickly, is that when you serve in the 101st, you're not going to stick around much at home. You're going to be gone and going places, because units like that get called on a lot for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, it's that they're very good, they're well trained, and they have good resources and equipment to be ready. And so, yeah, that's what you get with the 101st.
Well, that leads me to a slightly kind of related question, which is you went to Ranger School. And from my understanding and listening to a lot of military veterans talking about QRFs, quick reaction forces, it's oftentimes the Rangers that are the guys that show up to kind of, they're kind of the cavalry that shows up. And my understanding of Ranger School is that's the premier leadership school in the military, outside of the military academies, but within the military itself. Aside from the physical parts of Ranger School, which a lot of us have heard about, how difficult that is, what are the biggest lessons you feel like you took from Ranger School that kind of stood you in good stead throughout your career?
It reinforced a lot of things for me, John. There's certainly some pretty obvious things like selflessness. It's not about me, it's about the greater team. Sacrifice, that you sometimes have to sacrifice for the greater team and the mission. About teamwork, how you're not going to get through anything alone. You've got to rely on your buddies, and they need to be able to rely on you. So, okay, we all know that going in, right? Those aren't really, hard things to discover. But Ranger School amplifies that, because what they do is they strip away your sleep, and they strip away your food, and they put you in these rigorous conditions, desert, mountains, Florida swamps, and you have to lead under those conditions. And like we were talking about earlier, that's where you see the true nature of people come up. And that's where, you can get as close as you can to combat without live bullets flying. That's what leadership did for me. It just really amplified those lessons and how important that is. And that it sticks, it gets in your DNA.
So you have a quote on your website. I'd like you to give us some context around this, if you would.
Yeah.
And it says, what if we make this investment in our people and they leave us? What if we don't and they stay?
Yeah. So that was that's a quote I took. I found it. It's pretty popular, actually. This is a chief financial officer talking to a CFO. Of course, the CFO, or to a CEO. Of course, the CFO is all about money, right? And he's seeing these money expenditures into the training and investment in these people in the organization. And he's looking at it from strictly from a financial perspective, where he says to the CEO, this could be wasted money. We might not get our ROI back on this. So he makes the case that, well, what if we spend a lot of money and they end up leaving? We'll never get our money back. And of course, the CEO, who is more people focused and understands the investment in those that are in the organization, counters with, well, what if we don't and they stay, right? And so that it justifies that investment that you make in someone. Yeah, sure, they might leave you. Listen, I've got 4 people here in this little small company that I owned, and I know they're going to leave me someday. And so I've got a choice. I can not invest in them and hope they stick around for a while, or I can make the investment. And guess what? They're probably going to hang around, because that's what people are looking for in organizations. It's a great quote.
Yeah, I remember, I think only one boss in my big company corporate career who I really felt like had that investment in me, that even if it seemed like it ever got to the point where it wasn't a good fit anymore, he was like proactively on my side, like, hey, what can I do to help get you ready for that next role, whether that's a promotion here or moving on to some other company? Because we just had, I think, as in the corporate world, it was as close as a civilian would get to that sort of foxhole buddy, where you're working really long hours, you're traveling a lot, you're living out of suitcases, and you just have to really rely on those people that you work with. And unfortunately, it was an uncommon thing in my experience in the big companies that I worked for.
Yeah,
So
it's still that way, John. I see that a lot where people don't get that investment and they don't recognize that you have to be the champion for somebody like he was for you, even if that means you fly the coop someday and head on somewhere else.
it makes a huge difference, because I still remember to this day. I'm not embarrassed to say it anymore, although back then I would have been, but I cried when I left. Like, I packed up my box, and when I got to my car in the parking lot, I cried, because I loved that job. And the only reason I left was because the company was bought out, we were acquired, and my boss's boss told all of us, we're going to do the best we can to make sure everybody still has a job, but we're not in charge anymore. I was like 23 years old, and I was scared, and headhunter found me another job with a good salary, and I left. But I always look back and thought, what if I would have stayed? In hindsight, it was Blockbuster that I left, though. So with hindsight being 2020, it seems like it was a good idea at the time. But one of the things that I focus on in my business with teaching communication skills is listening. And I'm curious, in all of the different unique environments that you were put in, what are some of the unique challenges you had in listening to understand in your roles?
Yeah, well, I think a few things got in my way over the years, and I'm proud to say that I'm better at it. I wouldn't call myself an expert listener. I don't know if you find one out there, but as I reflect back on my time, and I carry these lessons forward now into my practice, the first was just immaturity. I mean, I was, as a younger officer, just not having the sense that I just needed to close my mouth and really listen and take it all in. Another was ego, which is still there in all of us, where you listen to respond versus listening to understand. So you're kind of like spring loaded and kind of leaning forward and waiting for the other person to stop so that you can come over the top. And you haven't heard a thing they've said. That got in the way. And then time can be a challenge too, because especially today, things are moving so fast that when we coach listening and we talk and we train listening, we do so from, of course, a very comfortable environment, to sit back and take it all in and take that time. And yeah, sure. I mean, and I try to do that hard, but boy, when things are moving fast and you've got to get something across because the next challenge is, around the corner, that can be a challenge to listening intently. So it's like all these forces at play that cause you to listen less, or listen to respond, or listen to anything but to understand. So yeah, they're prevalent, and they still are. And I just think as leaders, you've got to be conscious of them. I have this level of consciousness now when somebody is talking that I zero in and I listen, and I do this intently because they have something to say and I really want to understand it.
Yeah, that's great points. What I found that to be one of my biggest communication challenges still to this day. And I tell people all the time, keep something to write on and write with at all times. And for me, the biggest thing that does for me is I keep trying to remind myself whenever I want to interrupt, because I'm naturally curious, which is great, but can be sometimes inappropriate, is write down whatever it is I want to ask and then try to forget about it and stay focused. And even with that, to your point, I do this for a living. I train other people. It's one of those things, as human beings, it's hard.
Sure.
It's just a lot of natural instincts that we're fighting.
It is. Yep.
You mentioned awareness, and on your website, you mentioned self-awareness and 360 assessments are part of some of the things that you do in your coaching. Can you talk a little bit about the role of 360 assessments in your coaching?
Yeah, feedback is integral to a healthy work environment. And I've not seen anywhere really where that feedback is not included in some way, shape, or form. There's been a lot written about feedback in terms of how you get it and the value of it, what you do with it. So I mean, it's a study in and of itself. But one of the things I always said as a leader in the Army, I never wanted a soldier walking around my organization wondering how they were doing. And it speaks to feedback. So who is giving them feedback? How are they getting feedback on their performance and how they're doing and how they can improve in their life? And so it's so important for that aspect, that people are getting some sort of feedback, because nobody is standing still as an individual. Organizations don't stand still, and they grow. They grow, people in organizations. And the only way you can grow is to get the feedback as to how things went, how you're doing personally, how, what you're saying and what you're doing is affecting others. And so that's why it's so critical, and it's tough. Fear is at play here, and that's the biggest reason why people don't get feedback, because they're just afraid of offending somebody, and they're just nervous for that one-on-one conversation. But it's so important. I mean, you can't have a healthy organization without it.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that occurred to me when I was looking through some of your material was the importance of emotional intelligence. I think it's important in all communication, but in the context of what you did in the Army and what you do now in coaching, what are some of the ways that emotional intelligence presents itself as a challenge, where maybe people that you're coaching or working with have some gaps in their emotional intelligence? What are some of the ways that you've helped them work through that?
Yeah. Well, it's critical to have it, and there are stumbling blocks. One that jumps to mind, really, and it's indicative of our time, is this whole Zoom, connecting digitally like this and not in person, to see pick up on those cues and get a sense of somebody. What we don't get in these kind of video sessions that we have, which are very prevalent now in business, is we're interacting in a formal setting, some sort of meeting. There's an interaction going on. What I don't get to see is John at work interacting with others, just walking around in the break room, where I get to pick up on those cues of what makes him tick. What is it about him? We in the military is a very human endeavor. I mean, that's one of the notions that, we're just this machine with a bunch of weapons that go forth and do bad things to people. It's really, at the end of the day, a very human endeavor where we've got to get to know people, to leverage them for the most that they can give. So we were forced, in a sense, to get to know folks. And again, like I spoke of before, the rigors and the hardship, all that stuff comes out where your emotional intelligence is a bit easier to achieve. In private business and private organizations, a little harder, because you don't have those kind of conversations. It's okay, what is it that makes you tick? I think by default, we're picking up on some cues, and our emotional intelligence is gaining a little bit, but it still lacks greatly in terms of what's going on with people. I use an assessment called the Forte assessment. It's a strength assessment that is kind of a foundation of my coaching. And it measures things like dominance, non-dominance, introversion, extroversion, patience, impatience, conformity, non-conformity, all of which are strengths. You don't fall, wherever you fall on there are strengths. But it gives a sense of who somebody is. For instance, let's say you're very introverted and I'm very extroverted, but I don't know that. My emotional intelligence is not where it needs to be. And I'm leading you. So I thrust you into these social settings, or in meetings, I'm asking you for your feedback instantly, right there on the spot. As an introvert, you're not going to function very well, right? You can do social things all day long, but you need that quiet time to recharge your batteries, to think about your next move. I need to ask you, hey, John, I want your input on this. Can you come back tomorrow morning and tell me what you think of this? Give you that space to think through it, because you're going to come back and deliver something pretty profound. And that's what's missing, is we don't see each other beyond the name tag, the job description, or whatever else is there, that we're not getting to some of those root things. And there's simple ways you can do it. I think one is just interacting in a social setting away from the office. I coach leaders a lot, so that's where trust is built. You're going to gain trust in me and vice versa if you and I are in a social setting, get to know each other at a deeper level, and building and increasing and improving that emotional intelligence. A lot to it.
Yeah, what you said about introverts is very insightful. I'm kind of towards the middle, but a little more towards the introvert side. And I find there's a lot of confusion between introversion, shyness, and other things, where extroverts tend to have a little bit of a misunderstanding. And the core of it is what you hit on.
Totally.
is how people get energy and lose energy in social interactions. And that one little difference that you made, that one little tweak, let them have time to go off on their own, because that's where they recharge, and that's when they're more in their head. And to your point, they can be very insightful, very thoughtful. They're just a little bit less inclined to articulate that in groups. So
Yeah. And see, that's powerful to know, because, and that's where the intelligence piece comes in. I'm emotionally intelligent because I'm smarter about who you are, what makes you tick. So I can avoid things like, hey, John, I'm shoving you into this, or I'm expecting this out of you. I can tailor my approach.
So was it a Forte assessment? Is that the name of the one you mentioned?
Yeah, it's the FORTE. It's French for strength. And and I use it. It's a fantastic assessment. I use that in my coaching and a lot of my leadership interactions.
Yeah, when you described it, it sounded a little bit like what I've heard about the Big Five, or what's the other one, the Hexaco. It sounded like the characteristics of it were similar.
Yeah.
Do you use any other, like DISC or any of the other assessments in your practice?
I've used DISC before, done some work with Myers-Briggs. They're all very good. I mean, you're gonna gain value out of them. What I like about Forte, it takes about 8 minutes to complete it, and it spits back an instant report. It'll blow your mind. Like, how did it figure that out about me? Well, it's the guy running it has been doing it since 1978. So it's got deep history and analytics behind it that allows it to do that, because nobody's got time for a 45-page report and a 1-hour survey to fill out. Nobody's got time for that.
Yeah, yeah, it's very true. So I'm curious, you mentioned working in the virtual environment, and about a year ago, I stumbled across a YouTube channel called The Behavior Panel, and it's 4 guys who Dr. Phil refers to as like the top behavior analysis people on the planet. And I got really hooked on watching their videos, where they would they would show a video, typically maybe someone who's suspected of a crime and they're at a press conference or they're being interviewed or interrogated, and they'll show a little snippet, maybe 15, 30 seconds, and then all 4 of them will give commentary on it. And then they'll show the snippet again. And the first time that I watched it, I was like, this looks like a magic trick. Like the second time you watch it, you see it all, because now you know what to look for. And so it was about a year ago, I started learning more about that. And the challenge that I found is that with so much work being virtual, even with the knowledge and the skills to spot that stuff, it's increasingly difficult to see that, especially in groups, right? Because if I'm looking for things like watching your blink rate or your breathing or hand gestures or whatever, that becomes difficult as the size of your image on the screen starts to get smaller. So I'm curious, are you doing more work virtually or face-to-face these days?
I would say more virtually, and the pandemic brought that out. Now there is goodness there, right? I can get to more people. Yeah. I've got 4 coaching clients right now, 2 in North Carolina and 2 in New York City. And I did a big speech for Advanced Auto Parts corporate. There were a couple thousand people in the speech, but think of how hard it would be for that company to gather all those people in one place. Yep. Or how logistically difficult it would be for me to get to somebody in New York City to do coaching once a week. So it's helped in that respect, and it's effective in that respect. But there's still a void of this interaction at work.
Are there have you found any specific tools or tactics when you're working with people virtually in groups that have helped with that?
Well, I like when they're all gathered in the same place. Like I do interaction reports with Forte in a group setting. Okay. And it's fun when they're all together in the same room, because they can interact as I'm coaching them virtually through this session. So that's been helpful. Certainly cameras on is absolutely the way to go. I'm always skeptical when the camera's off. I just can't help it. You just don't know what somebody's doing and whether you have their attention or not. So that's a challenge. But it's I don't know. I think it's just having the direct attention of somebody on a session like this, and keeping them engaged, and that they're interacting, and kind of the discipline of the organization. Okay, shut everything off for a while in your environment. Focus in on this screen list, because it's the best you can do if that's all you can do, is be virtual.
Yeah, I've asked some of the people I've had on the program have had tips, but even some of the most accomplished communicators in the world, I'm hearing, feel a little bit frustrated because there's only so much you can do.
Yeah.
I've started to experiment with different tools. There's one called Mentimeter that I use. There's a bunch of them I've experimented with that
Mhm.
they're engagement tools. They add a little bit of gamification to things. And Chase Hughes, who's a guy that I'm going to have on next week, talks a lot about, he was in the DIA for years, spent 20 years
Yep.
in the Navy and working in intelligence. And he talks about one of the biggest ways to influence someone is with novelty. And all these different things that I'm trying to experiment with are along those lines, you know, different things that are novel, spacing them out so that every few minutes you're doing, even if it's something as simple as just going silent, because now those people that were distracted with something else are going, hey, what just happened? Somebody stopped. Right? There's like a million
Yeah.
different things you can try, but it's finding that sweet spot of the variety where it doesn't seem like, you know, it's turning into a variety show and it's getting, you know, off task, but there's
Yeah.
enough to keep people interested. So
Well, I use, you know, more to the question you asked. I try to treat it like I'm having a cup of coffee with somebody, and it's just the two of us sitting there in a coffee shop somewhere. It's a professional speaking technique. When you speak to an audience, you know, pretend as if you're having a cup of coffee with them. And then, of course, where you posture yourself, where the camera is, you know, so you're not off at an angle or, you know, some weird
yeah,
place. I try, especially when I'm speaking, is to get face level so that I'm looking straight into the camera, not up or down. So little techniques like that, I think, can make a big difference.
yeah, that was a huge one I stole from Mark Bowden. Has a whole video he did on virtual
Yeah.
speaking and training. And that was one of the things that I took is I usually had my camera on the top of my monitor. So I'd be looking up like this while you're over here on my screen. And then when I would see a recording back, there was this disconnect. And what he pointed out that I noticed after I watched it was, well, that disconnect you're getting when you're watching the video back is what everybody's getting live, right?
Yeah.
So the more you can make it look like I'm looking you in the eye, you know, the more you're going to get that engagement. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, there's just, it seems like a constant challenge, but to your point, the upside of it is that it does allow us to get to more people, have more
It does.
reach. Um, and for us from a business perspective, that's good for our business, but it's also for a lot of these companies, they're now doing more training that they wouldn't have done before because it wasn't
Mhm.
in the budget. If they had to fly someone like you out and pay all your, not just whatever your speaking fee or your training fee, but now all your travel expenses. Now that the
Sure.
travel expenses go away, now it's a whole different conversation. Now maybe you're actually able to provide more value. And now, yeah, we've got to deal with these virtual challenges, um, but it opens up a little bit more of a value gap.
It does.
I find it interesting too that you said having them all in a room. Um, I've actually found those hybrid situations more challenging, but I think my guess is that the reason you've had success with it is you've probably done a lot of the work up front to make sure that they're set up properly. Because
Yeah, yeah, because what I'm trying to do there is to create some synergy between them and some interaction and bonding. And it's very powerful if it can happen in a room like that for sure.
yeah, I was at a networking event last week that was hybrid. So I
Mm.
was on Zoom. There were 3 other people on Zoom, and then a room full of people live face to face together. And unfortunately, whoever set up the laptop that we were viewing forgot about us. And so we just got room noise. So we couldn't even talk to each other on Zoom, and we could barely hear them on the audio. And it ended up not working out very well. But then afterwards, we did a little debrief with the person running the networking event, and they were like, okay, there's like 3 things we can do to fix that so that next time it's a better experience.
Yeah,
And once you sort of work out the kinks, then we get to a point where, yeah, now this hybrid thing actually can have some legs, and really add a lot of value where now I'm not losing an hour and a half in commute time. And now it opens up more possibilities for all of us to be able to participate in more things.
sure. Yep.
So, um, so I wanted to touch on something. that we had talked about this before, and it's something that I think you're uniquely qualified to speak to. And it's a situation in Afghanistan and how we pulled out. And it seems like I try to not watch too much news. I try to watch enough to keep up with things, but it seems like the coverage has kind of died off. I know there was a period there where there was a handful of either current or I guess technically the former special operations guys, Tim Kennedy and Chad Robichaux and a group of guys that they took, that there was a lot of controversy because they were going in trying to help, and people didn't realize that they were actually coordinating with all of the right people. But what are your thoughts on how that all went down and kind of where we are today and going forward? Your thoughts on what we can do as a country better?
Yeah, well,
it's not too big of a question.
It's a huge question, but it's a worthwhile question because I know it is on the minds of people. There's a few pieces to this. I certainly think that if it's not affecting us in our daily lives, then we tend to lose, interest and attention. And that's one of the disadvantages, I guess you could say, we have in the United States, is that we are so isolated with oceans and, two non-threatening countries to our north and south, that we suffer from that. It's not on our borders. We're not seeing it up close and personal. Afghanistan, we certainly should have gone in there, and after 9/11, but we made some pretty strategic mistakes early on, and I think that we thought we could make something out of this country, where in actuality it has to self-actualize. It has to find its own way, and that's hard. And look, if you're going to commit to doing what we try to do in Afghanistan, you're signing up for the better part of 100 years. Because it's going to take generations to wean them out of the violence and the history of what happened there. And millions of service members, which we don't have the people and the money to do something like that. So it's easy to get into wars, relatively easy, very difficult to get out of them. And we've seen the results of that in the last two. There was never any kind of cohesive, long-term, enduring strategy. I compare it to the Cold War, where the strategy was containment, contain the Soviet Union, and stand up against communism, and eventually it falls on its own. And that endured through several presidential administrations, and it worked over time. Here, it was like every presidential administration, every unit that came in year after year in Afghanistan was reinventing the rules. And the Taliban aren't dumb. They may not have sophisticated weapons and whatnot, but they were watching and waiting us out. And they don't necessarily care that they've lost thousands of fighters. They could wait us out and watch this go down, so they could see it coming. There was political failure for sure in terms of a cohesive strategy and commitment of the nation, and seeing this thing as a long-term thing. There were these surges we can put in place where we thought, okay, this is going to turn the tide, when in fact they didn't. And there was just way too much management of, okay, we're going to send 30,000 troops. Okay, why 30,000? Why not 35? Well, what is it we're trying to achieve? You start there, and then you apply the numbers to that. Instead, it was backwards. A lot of these blunders. Militarily, I say often, we have some ownership in this failure, and I have ownership in it because I was a commander there twice. We were a football team at a baseball game, right? We went in as a conventional force looking to fight somebody, tank on tank, weapon on weapon, soldier on soldier. Well, what we found was an insurgency immersed in the population, hard to detect, fighting us in different ways where we were weak. But we kept fighting this, football game, rigid, linear, down the field, blocking and tackling, instead of really kind of getting immersed into the population and understanding what was happening and social grievances and addressing those, which was really fueling the insurgency. So there was a lot of misstep there, because there is this comfortable vision of war, what we think war ought to be, and this is what we train towards. But then we get someplace, we find out it's something very different, because the enemy gets a vote. So we pulled out, and we did so rapidly and very sloppily, and it was bad. Look, John, the unfortunate reality of our times is we're going to have men and women in harm's way in some very dangerous places, forward on the ground where threats emanate, not sitting here on our shores trying to fight this thing over the horizon, as they say. It won't work. Nobody wants the troops home more than I, but we're just not going to be able to fight this by sitting at home. We've got to have to be in dangerous places. So something should have stayed there so that we at least had entry and some sort of influence on our national government. There were certainly, successes we could have exploited and gotten on board with, but I just think it was a long series of missteps that led to this, and then eventually it was just like, okay, let's pull out. We're in a dangerous place today, right? We can't control what happens in the borders of Afghanistan. We have no influence on that anymore. Let's not fool ourselves. I think a drone strike that takes out a bad actor, like we've seen a few, has really had any major impact. It certainly sends a message, and it's not entirely a bad thing, but it doesn't change the tide of terrorism and what's happening in these places. And so it was sad, and I wrote an article about this. I can share with you. Maybe you can put the notes on the thing. It just talks about more in depth in terms of how I saw this go down, what the mistakes were, and then what we do going forward. Which is, in closing, we've got to learn from this and never make this mistake again. I'm worried that we haven't. I'm worried this is a post-Vietnam era all over again, where we look back, it's okay, we're never doing that again. But yet we get thrust into some place in harm's way again somewhere. We just have to, refresh those lessons of old where they're long gone. So I'm afraid we're kind of losing the lessons of that. We're not keeping those at the forefront. And they just got to keep this in the conversation, national conversation of look, this happened and we should know better, and we should, as a nation, go to war, not just the military. So there's a lot of things that occurred that in many ways, I wasn't surprised in terms of how things ended, though it just went very rapidly and very sloppily. So just sad all around it. And the only hope is that, that we've left behind in memory a taste of freedom that they got, that they'll remember and maybe on their own rise up and bring this to the forefront at some point in time in their own nation, which would really make, the service of those, especially the fallen, worthwhile and not in vain.
So this kind of makes me wonder about, I don't know if it's related, but give me your thoughts on it, if it's related, the recruiting challenge that the military is having. I don't remember how many years ago, but several years ago, I watched a TED Talk by, I believe it was an Army general who was talking about obesity as a national security issue. So I know that's part of the challenge with recruiting. We've got a lot of young people who simply can't physically qualify to get into the military. But how much do you think, if any, how everything went down in Afghanistan and sort of the civilian sentiment towards the military is factoring into the recruiting challenges?
I don't know, John. I don't know that I could answer that intelligently in terms of what's happening and why it's happening. I certainly believe that, I think it's not a stretch what you just said. As they look at this, it's okay, why would I send my son and daughter into this when the nation doesn't support it, or at least the presidential administration don't get behind those they send into harm's way, or watch how sloppy we've done it. I imagine that's probably got a lot to do with it as well, in terms of recruiting challenges. And yeah, a vast majority of the country can't get into, I think it's something like 70% of our nation cannot serve in the military for physical reasons and other reasons, which is pretty scary. So,
yeah, I think Tim Kennedy put out a social media post about that and kind of went through a list of all the different reasons, most of which were, to your point, either they weren't physically fit enough, or there's so many of them that have experimented with recreational drugs that would disqualify them, all kinds of different reasons. And you had mentioned in another interview that you like the idea of everyone having to serve, not necessarily in the military, but some type of service to the country. Can you talk about your thoughts on that? Because I thought it was an interesting viewpoint.
Yeah, I just know from personal experience what the Army did for me. And that was the stripping of my individuality and the, you know, making me a soldier into this bigger team and squeezing that selfishness out of me and making me a selfless server. I have, and almost every veteran I talk to has service in their DNA because they see the benefits of it. That's what that gets into us. And so, yeah, I think some sort of national service would be in order. I think a draft is a stretch. I'm not sure that's, you know, a worthy thing, but wouldn't it be great if there was some requirement of some sort, or maybe more of a attractiveness to serve the country in some fashion, you know, to become part of something bigger than oneself. Because you can see it in veterans wherever you go. That stuff sticks. You know, we're soldiers,
Yeah.
sailors, airmen, Marines the rest of our lives, and we carry that forward.
Yeah, I see it even just growing up as an Army brat, even never having served, that a lot of the values that I still stick to today are values instilled in me by my dad that he got from the Army, and that, you know, my extended family, they all kind of learned those lessons. And I guess that's what I'm very optimistic, because there are so many military veterans that
Yep.
are running for office, all the way from local level up to, you know, the Senate and Congress, and
Yep.
and are banding together and helping support each other and trying to get their voices heard. So that makes me optimistic. But the part that worries me is exactly the opposite, the opposite side of the same thing, which is it's a values thing. It's a breakdown in fundamental values, where we're kind of getting off the same page. And sometimes I try not to listen to some of these voices, but sometimes I'll hear these people talking about how some of our enemies are playing the long game, where they're playing a 20-year or a 50-year game, where they're sort of infiltrating more at a societal, cultural level with different things that kind of come in under the wire, that are very difficult to perceive if you don't know what you're looking for. Kind of like what I was talking about with those behavior panel guys. You watch it and you see nothing. And then somebody shows you what to look for. Then you watch it again and you go, oh gosh, I missed all that. Right?
Yeah, it's true. I wrote about this
yeah.
in an article I wrote about Ukraine when that first went down, when Russia first went in there, about, you know, the 40-mile convoy in our own country, which exists, and it exists in the form of cyber attacks from China and Russia. It exists in the form of their infiltration into our intellectual property, into private companies and in academia, and all those things. So the threat is real. The problem is we have this conventional view of a threat. It's not a problem. It's not a threat. It's not a threat until we see a mushroom cloud or a leveled city or refugees on the march. And unfortunately, it's not. And in the end, and our enemies know that. They know they can sneak under the radar and get away with it like that. And I hope that we're catching up.
Yeah, it seems like so many people feel like if it's not a visible physical threat, then it's not a threat. Yeah, when I think about all of the supply chain that's controlled by, I don't remember what the percentage is, but like the American meat market, like some huge percentage of the meat supply in this country is controlled by Chinese entities. I mean, they took over, was it Smithfield Foods years ago? And there's all these things that are happening sort of under the consciousness of, if people aren't really paying attention. And again, my optimism is that we've got people like the Jocko Willings of the world who are saying, what do you mean we can't make this stuff in the US? That's a bunch of BS. Hold my beer. And they're doing it with, like, I don't know if you follow Jocko Willink and his company Origin, and, you know, all the different products that they make, all made in the USA, everything from the raw materials to the labor, everything. And then the challenge that I worry about there is their prices are higher because they're paying an American wage. And we're so used to paying these cheaper prices for slave labor from other countries. And I'm still, I probably sound like a crazy person to some people, but I'm still optimistic, because there are people that are rising up and saying, you know what, I didn't want to get involved in politics, but doggone it, somebody's got to do it. And I got this in my bones to serve something bigger than myself and my country. okay, I'll take one for the team. I'll suck it up for 4 years or whatever the term is to do my duty to kind of get this ball moving back in the right direction.
Yeah, yeah. No, I hear you, John. I mean, and back to your original point there is the values piece of this. You grew up in a values-based society.
Very much so.
That's what I talk about my children is the goodness of being a military family is that I came home every day talking about selfless service and maybe what somebody might have done that was just not helpful to the organization, and how it was really about the mission and the people around us. And so they saw that day in and day out, as you did for 30 years. And that gets into your DNA, whether you served or not, you still have that. So yeah, I'm optimistic like you. I do think that most of our countrymen and women wake up each day wanting to do good, and are smart enough and agile enough to bring some of these things back into our own nation so that we're not relying upon those that wish us harm.
Well, so let's wrap up on a positive here, because the work that you do is very much in the same vein of what we're talking about here, about the things to be optimistic about. Tell me a little bit about some of the specific coaching work that you do and the types of organizations that are your sweet spot, that are really like the best clients for you, that you can really sort of move the needle with the most.
Yeah, I've been coached, by other business experts, to niche down, right? Go one place and focus on one thing. And I confess that I'm not. I'm spread all over the place. But here's the common piece, John, is that a company at the end of the day is a collection of people. And it's got a mission, it's got a cause that it serves. And so there's commonality anywhere. Where I get someone that's leading people, 2 people or 200, the same concepts apply, because we're all in this human journey, this human endeavor together. And so I'm able to do that. Now, I've worked in pharmaceuticals, I've worked in the trades, I've done some work with government organizations, fish and wildlife, and the military. I had done some work with sheriffs, police, law enforcement, first responders, with nurses and medical organizations. So a wide variety, and it's a lot of fun because you can get in there and get a sense of what the nuances are inside their own organizations and their industries. But at its core, the conversation I'm having in any one of those places is very similar, because they're trying to influence somebody to do something they might not otherwise do. They're trying to invest in someone to get them to the next journey. So coaching for me, it's all about the process, and the process works. And if you stick with it, you can get there. It's at least a 3 months journey. Anybody that comes to me that wants coaching and can't commit for that length of time, they're just not serious about it. Because it's like working out in a gym. You're not going to see results in 30 days. Right? It may even take the better part of 90 days to start to see some changes. And that's what coaching is, the same thing. Leadership is the same thing. It takes time and repetition and practice. So usually between 3 months minimum, and usually 6 months is optimal to see that kind of growth. We start off with self-awareness, the Forte assessment, get to know each other on a deeper level. And then we travel a journey where we show up once a week for an hour and talk about what's weighing them down. I do a lot of listening. And it's different from what we did in the military and counseling, because I was the senior person. I had the experience and I had authority. In coaching, it's a peer relationship. I don't outrank the person at all. And it's non-judgmental. If they came in and they didn't do something they said they were going to commit to, I'm only going to ask out of curiosity why that didn't occur, and kind of tease out some things. My job as a coach is to shed light on things that are in them already, because the answers lie within them. It's just my job to tease those out. So it's completely the opposite of, okay, John, you're struggling with X. Well, here's what you do. Follow these steps, try that, and the result will be, go give that a shot, come back and tell me how it went. That's not coaching. Coaching is, why is that a challenge for you, John? What's the hardest part? Okay, what happened when you did that? What did you feel? What were the results? What did people say? How'd they react? Okay, what do you think you can do to fix that? What's a step you could take perhaps to get to a better place, to be able to build a confidence or perform a bit better? And you're going to dig hard. You're going to struggle a little bit. You're like in the deep end of the pool, and you'll discover the answer. And I can help tease that out. Now, I don't just sit there and fold my arms. I have a lot to offer. and I can offer concepts on how they can communicate better and approach situations like that, problem solve better, lead up and lead down, and all the things that go with it. So that's the coaching journey. And when I get someone that's really dedicated and committed to it, then we've got a good thing.
So the first step of that is that free 30-minute leadership coaching session that you offer.
Yes.
How does someone get in touch with you to get that ball rolling? If they've been listening to this going, I got to reach out. I need to talk to Rob.
Yeah. There's two main ways. The first is my website. You go on there and connect with Rob, and you can find me there. The second is LinkedIn. Very active on LinkedIn, got 20,000 followers. So a great place to connect right there on LinkedIn and reach out to me.
And we'll put all that in the show notes. So everybody has that. So it's easy for them to get in touch with you. So I like to wrap up with kind of a fun question. Imagine if I gave you a free billboard and the only caveat was you can't use it to advertise your business. What would you put on a billboard?
What would I put on the billboard? Go invest in your people. I mean, that was my mantra in Brigade Command, investing in people. And so I would pose that. I would present that as a concept, maybe with some neat graphic to support it, and to get them thinking. You know, to invest in something is to dedicate time, talent, resources to get something in return, and that is to make better people. That's what investing in people is all about. So,
yeah,
there it is.
That's a great way to wrap up. Well, Rob, thank you very much for your time. I could talk to you all day. I've got a million other questions I'd like to ask you, but maybe we can have you back on sometime down the road and explore some of those. For all of those of you that are listening and watching, if you're interested in coaching, reach out to Rob, get the ball rolling.
Thanks, John.
Thanks again. We'll see you next time.